am Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. As news regarding Kashmiri politician Farooq Abdullah's detention under the Public Safety Act by the Indian state sparks widespread outrage, it also renews the discussion regarding how the Indian state has been using this act since 1978. Amnesty International described the act as a lawless law, and yet the act seems to be routinely used as an intimidation tactic. We take a closer look at the wider implications of this. Joining us for this discussion today is Asad Rahim Khan, who's a barrister joining us from Lahore, and Ms. Leva Miluna, who's an international law expert joining us from Leva. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Ms. Miluna, before we jump to what is happening in Kashmir, I do want to talk to you a little more about, according to international standards, what constitutes as unfair detention?
Unfair detention, in principle, is defined as detaining a person without showing the charges. So basically, it has to go in the framework of the rule of law. So basically, arbitrary detentions are absolutely prohibited in international law.
Right. And why exactly are they prohibited? I mean, what is the widespread impact of this when the charges are not shown, when the system is not transparent?
Well, it is due to political reasons because, in principle, in international law, the law is made by the society and for the society. Of course, politicians are the ones that make the laws. So basically, it has a large political impact of what is to be considered as a reason to detain persons and arrest people.
Right. Mr. Khan, I'm going to jump to you and talk a little more about the conversation regarding how the state governs an individual. Now, an individual expects protection from the state, and the Public Safety Act, the premise of it is that it is supposed to maintain public order. But when the system isn't transparent, when the numbers rise and no one knows where these people are going, what the charges are, how does that disrupt a trust between the individual and the state that's supposed to maintain order?
No, I think you're absolutely right, Meshal. We have to understand that this is an inherently ridiculous legal cover, which is made evident by the fact that in January 2017, I think it was the then Chief Minister, who is now also detained, Mehbooba Mufti, said that from 2007 to the 10 years after, over 2,400 Public Safety Act detention orders were passed, and 58% of those were quashed by the courts. So what we're seeing here is that this is essentially an overarching instrument of coercion. It's no accident that over the past many years, over 20,000 activists, 20,000 persons involved in political activities or alleged to have been involved in various activities that might jeopardize public safety have been detained in Kashmir. And to follow on from what you were saying earlier about the state's protections, I think the act was created right after emergency in 1978 to ensure that those protections are stripped away. International human rights law tells us that every person has the right to counsel. This law does not provide for that. They say that you have to be immediately informed. Other people have to be immediately informed of your detention. This law does not provide for that. And worst of all, that the advisory committee that this law provides for, you are not afforded the right to counsel before the advisory committee. So this hammers away at your protections. Even at the stage of judicial review, a person who goes through the PSA Act is not afforded an ordinary appellate hearing. So what we're seeing is a law that is inherently draconian, that ensures that the state can keep you, coerce you, and do various other things that might be beyond the ambit of this program. And it is something that is unconstitutional should its own procedure be followed. Regardless of how draconian or brutal this law is, even within the four corners of the draft of this legislation, it does not follow its own procedure either. So what we're looking at is essentially a human rights black hole.
Right. And Mr. Khan, just picking up on the point where you say that even counsel is denied, expand upon that a little more for our viewers to understand how grave the implications of that is.
Well, I think we can talk about principles of natural justice. We can talk about how important it is to put your side forward. We can talk about the right of a fair hearing. We can talk about the Magna Carta. I'm struggling for words at how essential this requisite is. But the right to fair counsel, the right to counsel is enshrined in anything that is quasi-legal, in anything that might prejudice your rights. And over here, you have a district magistrate who has essentially been empowered to decide your fate. Once a person is detained under the PSA, it is a district magistrate that decides how to forward the case, what to tell the person who has been detained. In many circumstances, the person himself does not know. So I think one question that even precedes yours is that before I engage counsel, what am I in for? But once you breach that step, the advisory committee does not allow you to defend yourself either. So what we're seeing here in terms of right to counsel being prejudiced, in terms of not even being told what you're there for, is essentially a draconian measure that's aimed at stifling basic freedoms. And I don't think there's any other way about it. This is not something that is premised on public safety. This is something that is supposed to subjugate the will of the indigenous Kashmiri people.
Right. And that's an interesting statement you made there, that nothing about this is premised on public safety. And to that point, I want to go to Ms. Miluna and talk to her about this, that given everything, when a person is not even notified regarding what the charges are as to why they're being detained, and that too for up to 2 years, does any of this, in any context, sound like this could be for the safety or the order of a society?
Well, in principle, in this regard, I have scrutinized the Public Safety Act. It has a large impact from the perspective of the involvement of government policies. Basically, it defines prohibited places, protected areas where individuals from Kashmir cannot enter. So at the same time, it has few human rights guarantees, but it's not enough. The whole act is overwhelmed by the government and the advisory board's role, and basically it is political. But we cannot solve political disputes by implicating the laws with political distinctions. So basically, we have to comply with international law. And in international law, there is this basic principle in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties that we cannot refer to national laws in order not to comply with international law. And in this respect, Public Safety Act is largely not compatible with human rights standards. We also saw from the practice of India at the United Nations that, in principle, it has not ratified 2 optional protocols related to death penalty and individual petitions that India, in principle, can involve its people in their implementation at the international level, at the UN level.
Right. On that point, I want to introduce another guest who's joined us, Mr. Cadman, who's an international law expert joining us in the Islamabad studios. Thank you so much, Mr. Cadman, for taking out the time and talking to us. Now, India has ratified the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in that too, fair trial is guaranteed. Now, given with the Public Safety Act and the UN's own reports say that this act needs to be reworked, it needs to be scraped because it's a draconian law. What international measures can be taken to guarantee that India abides by the international guidelines that are existing in order to protect civilians from unfair detention?
Well, you've mentioned the Universal Declaration. Of course, there are a number of other treaties that India has enacted. But as the other guest has said, they haven't enacted the additional protocols that allow individual petitions to be brought through the UN Human Rights Committee. Of course, you have the UN Special Procedures, which is a body that can review cases of arbitrary detention and forced disappearance, torture, and summary execution. But of course, if India wants to ignore them, they will. And as we've seen in the past, India has an appalling record as far as its adherence to international human rights standards is concerned. And it quite frequently ignores the legal rules that it claims to abide by. Kashmir being one of the most terrifying examples. So the difficulty is in terms of enforceability. Of course, India is not a member of the International Criminal Court, so there's no possibility of bringing a case in the International Criminal Court against India for its actions in Kashmir. But of course, there are ways in which, through the UN Human Rights Council, I would say the diplomatic pressure can be put on India. And what we're talking about is not a situation with a handful of isolated cases. We're talking about tens of thousands of individuals who have been arbitrarily and in many cases unlawfully detained without charge. And the Public Security Act that you talk about being draconian, of course it needs to be completely scrapped because it's being used by the Indian state to circumvent the rule of law. And that is something which is deeply disturbing.
Right. Mr. Khan, now going to and talking about how this draconian law is being used in Kashmir, in Indian occupied Kashmir, how does that impact stability overall? The legal system, I mean, you would say that the justice system is broken, but it seems here the justice system doesn't exist at all.
I think it depends on what you define as justice. As we said before, this is not about justice. This is essentially trying to legalize a coercive instrument. And I think one of the most disturbing things about this entire situation is that the PSA also, although it itself does not make a provision for the same, under the PSA, children are being detained left, right, and center. One of the major factors that the human rights organizations across the spectrum have mentioned, regardless of their position on India, is the deeply disturbing fact that children continue to be detained by the PSA, and not just after 5th August, but previously as well. So the fact of the matter is that fair trials have been afforded to the rest of India. There is no caveat, no justification, no reasoning that the legal system does not provide for fair trials within occupied Kashmir, rather than bringing in the PSA, which is essentially a systematic stripping away of any procedural requirements, any rights, any protections that a person may be afforded. So I think we need to look at it that way. To answer the second part of your question, is the justice system broken? We've seen some very light cognizance being taken by the Supreme Court of India. The Chief Justice of India has said that he will visit Srinagar. But the fact of the matter is that the legislature, Mr. Farooq Abdullah, has been detained under the PSA, and Mr. Farooq Abdullah is a sitting Lok Sabha member from Srinagar. He is a chief minister, his son was a chief minister, his father was a chief minister. So if the people who have been tasked to write your laws are essentially in detention under the same draconian act, and also this is unprecedented because Mr. Farooq Abdullah is the first leader to be detained under the PSA in recent days, what we are seeing is a slide towards essentially despotism.
Right. Mr. Cadman, talking a little more about the point that Mr. Khan here mentioned as well, the detention of children under the PSA. Now, a petition was also filed in the Supreme Court seeking the release of children that were detained after August 5th by 2 child rights activists. Now, detention isn't the only issue here. It's also what comes after. Notification, transparency in the process of who is being detained, where they're being detained, notifying the families. In that, what are the guiding principles that are supposed to exist in accordance to international law?
Well, I think what you're looking at is two separate issues. First of all, the the arrest and detention of children as a first issue, which of course is disturbing enough in itself. There are very few states that actually detain children as part of a process such as this. The only other country that I'm aware of that does it to the same extent as India is Israel, detaining Palestinian children. And then the second part of your question are the procedural rights that have to be afforded in a process such as this. I mean, these are basic fundamental rights. The right to be informed of the nature of the charges or allegations against you, the right to have a lawyer or family member informed of your arrest, detention, and your whereabouts, and then basic rights during the criminal process. I mean, these are fundamental rights that are written in numerous human rights treaties as a way of preventing state power over individuals, or the abuse of state power over individuals. But of course, on a much more fundamental level, we also have international rules over what is arguably considered the unlawful annexation of a state. So, there are lots of different human rights issues that we need to look at, and a number of issues under international law that regulate India's conduct in Kashmir. And as I noted, these are basic fundamental rights that in most states we take for granted, but in Kashmir are just removed. Right. And these individuals who arguably are exercising their right to protest, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, are being stripped of these rights. They are being thrown in jail. We have no idea in many of these cases the way they're being treated. And when we're talking about children being detained, there are particular safeguards that need to be in place, which clearly are not in place.
Right. And Mr. Cadman, as mentioned here, that the issue in Kashmir is definitely very complex and has several layers to it. And all of this, when the international community is trying to make sense out of what can be done, you've mentioned before the issues when it comes to dealing with India in this regard. What are the options that seem to be emerging at this point in time?
Well, there are of course a number of options that the government of Pakistan has, as well as a number of other states that support the government of Pakistan's position and are looking to safeguard the rights of Kashmiri civilians. There are, of course, a number of mechanisms through the United Nations special procedures. The question of how effective that is and how quickly they can respond is questionable, of course. There is, of course, the platform of the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is now ongoing. And of course, there is the United Nations General Assembly, where the Prime Minister Imran Khan will obviously be delivering his speech on the issue of Kashmir. But there is, of course, the issue of the International Court of Justice. And the government of Pakistan, as well as other states, have the ability to take India to the International Court of Justice on the basis of the unlawful annexation or land grabbing of Kashmir, with the steps that have been taken by India, which are clearly unlawful and can be tested in the International Court of Justice, as well as the widespread and systematic human rights violations that are being committed by the Indian state against Kashmiri civilians. Those are some of the steps that can be taken. And of course, criminal cases can be mounted under what's called universal jurisdiction, where it can be determined that individuals and units that are committing human rights violations that constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity can be brought in national courts across the globe that have universal jurisdiction.
Sorry to interrupt you there, but I do want to talk to Leva Miluna a little here and ask her, now, do you think when we're talking about the pressure that needs to be placed on India diplomatically, or in terms of the options that Mr. Cadman outlined here for us that can be taken in order to at least bring notice and bring attention and somehow try to bring about solutions to the issue of Kashmir. Do you think that the international community has had an apathetic attitude towards all of this, especially when we're talking about international laws being violated?
Yes, in principle, this case reminds me about certain elements from the Israel-Palestinian dispute and also Ukrainian case. I think that, yes, the international community is not that reluctant to solve this question by diplomatic means. And I think that that it should rather be solved on the basis of state-to-state relations, because it is also one of the principle of governance, the element of the rule of law, that state-to-state relations still may be significant means to solve this international dispute. But of course, we can go through also the UN system, and particularly in that respect, I would suggest the UN General Assembly.
Right. Mr. Khan, now on the point that Ms. Miluna also highlighted, how this reminds her of the case in Palestine and the Palestine-Israeli conflict. Now, we know about what has happened there. If we look at Gaza alone, the economy is in a free fall. The World Bank states that it will almost be unlivable by 2020. Now, given that, do you think that the international community has learned its lessons in being apathetic to these conflicts, being apathetic to annexation, and when you take control of a territory like this?
No, I don't think the international community has learned its lesson. The trajectory of the international community, whether through Bosnia, to Iraq, to Syria, to Palestine, is in front of us. But I also think that you don't need to read Robert Fisk or affiliated thinkers to know that Israel's fingerprints are all over this project. Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Modi's growing closeness is culminating in what you are seeing in Kashmir. This is a West Bank formula in which you are trying to create settlements of militarized Hindutva settlers, with the end goal being demographic change. And to follow on from what we were talking about in terms of international law, demographic change, i.e. where you try to transfer your native population into an occupied territory, is also a war crime under the Geneva Conventions. So there's, I think, clarity in everyone's mind that this is essentially a Hindutva project with Israeli advice on ground, that you are trying to create an enclave by pushing the indigenous people of Kashmir further and further to the corner. You are going to mount demographic change. It is in the interests of the international community.
Mr. Khan, that is a very important point you mentioned here, the point about ethnic cleansing, and that's a question I want to leave to Mr. Cadman before we wrap up this segment. Now, as it's been stated, it seems like a system is being imprinted on Kashmir, a system of oppression, and that of ethnic cleansing. Now, when that happens, when communities are being targeted by settlers or invaders, do they not have the right to rebel against the settlers and the oppressors?
Well, as the other guest, Mr. Khan, has said, there are certain rules and international law that relate to occupation, and in particular, moving one demographic out and moving in another demographic. It relates to a war crime in itself. And so if there is evidence of the Indian government moving a certain population into Kashmir and making the living conditions so unbearable that the Kashmiri are forced to leave, then yes, of course, that constitutes a war crime. And of course, if that is what is happening, there is a right to defend oneself, and that is recognised under international law. And I think what both guests have stated, the correlation or the similarities between what we have experienced for years in Palestine, there are striking similarities here. And as I'd mentioned about the unlawful annexation, I think what we've seen in East Jerusalem in particular and West Bank and what we saw recently in Crimea are hallmarks of a process which is being repeated here. Now, it's not for me to say whether Modi is taking instructions from Israel or the Russian
Mr.
state.
Cadman, we're going to take a short break. When we return, we discuss how much can developing economies rely on trade for growth and development. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, development for any economy, whether developing or developed, is the end game. But in this globalized system, with trade dynamics changing constantly, how important is it for developing economies to concentrate on their exports, and how can that help in their growth trends? Joining us for this discussion is Ms. Vicky Price, economist joining us from London, and Mr. Gilbert Van Kerckhove, who's an economist and author of the book Toxic Capitalism, joining us from Beijing. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Ms. Price, I'd like to begin with you. Now, trying to go and understand the central question here, how important is trade for a developing economy?
I think it's hugely important. I mean, even when you're looking at developed countries, when we think perhaps, we've reached the point where we can handle things by ourselves, the reality is we're all hugely interconnected. For a developing country, exports matter hugely because, of course, what they do is they encourage innovation. You sell your goods in a competitive environment. And what tends to happen is that it is exporting firms that are the most productive in any economy. And of course, the moment companies start exporting, they understand what the market is like elsewhere. They can then expand into other areas. They learn new ways of doing things that can spread across the economy. So the impact is enormous. And even when I was working here for the government and we were doing export studies, we had to still explain from scratch how important exporting was and how the help that needs to be given in embassies all around the world was absolutely essential so that people understand what the conditions are for being able to be successful in their export efforts.
Right. And some of the points you mentioned here are those that I want to elaborate upon a little further. But before that, I want to move to Mr. Gilbert, talk to him a little about the point that Ms. Price mentioned here, that economies are so interconnected. There is a free flow of ideas, technology. In all of this movement of ideas, technology, goods, do some economies benefit more than others? Is there an inequality to all of this?
I think the inequality depends totally on the country. I'm based in Beijing, China, and if you just look at the past 40 years, what happened in this country. When I came here, it was a medieval country. It was completely underdeveloped. Today, it's fascinating. We have high-speed trains, we have telecom, we have the high-tech industry. This has not come like this automatically. So it is, like the lady said, it's very important. If you do the right export together with firms that come here, like in China, to invest, to transfer technologies, and to also convey expertise, this is what really drives the development of a country, like in the case of China. You can say, well, in these 40 years, why did China become the factory of the world? Why did it become a superpower, so to speak? Why did other countries did not achieve the same? I think there you have to go to the details. And it requires a lot of effort, a lot of support also from the government. Because if you build a factory, if you don't have the backup of the government, then how can you operate? Very important are things like infrastructure, shipping. If you look at countries like Cambodia today, who are increasingly trying to export, they got blocked because the export time from the factory to the harbor is much too long. It's 2 weeks. In China, everything is really quick. We have harbors everywhere. We have a very big array of highways, high-speed trains, railways, generally speaking. This requires, of course, intervention from the government. If you don't have telecommunications, if you don't have electricity, if you don't have water, how can you work? The government has to make a deal with the private industry to let it grow. Despite the fact we are called here China a communist country, it is basically a capitalist country controlled by the government. But this was possible because they allowed the private sector to boom and to make factories and to make money. Why is China a factory of the world? Because it was capable of delivering the right products at the right time, at the right quality, and at the right price.
Right. On that point, Mr. Gilbert, I want to go back to Ms. Price. Talk to her a little more about this point, government support, and also what she mentioned earlier about exporting companies being the backbone in terms of production. What did you mean there, and expand upon that point a little more for us?
Of course, if you look at any economy which is very connected with the world's sort of global trading system, they tend to do well. We've just been hearing about China. The way that China actually developed and grew is because it started accessing the rest of the world. And it's now very much part of the whole globalization movement that has taken place. But of course, at the very beginning, and I'm sure for some time, for a while after that, they were getting quite a lot of help and subsidies from the government. And if you are a developing nation, you need to absolutely get that support. But what it does for your economy is it forces you, if you like, to introduce new ways of doing things. And I'm not just talking about producing things cheaply, that any country can really do, a developing country, and sell elsewhere, as long as it's not considered to be dumping exports anywhere. But it is really the techniques that you can use to be most productive and to be able to compete. And it is those techniques that are so important for a developing nation because, as I mentioned at the beginning, what it allows you to do is to spread that type of expertise across. And of course, exporting companies, because they need to do that to be able to compete, tend inevitably to be more productive than they were before, and certainly more productive than the rest of the sector. As it spreads elsewhere and as workers have developed better skills, then that has a very important multiplier effect across the economy. So exports are absolutely vital, and being open to the world is absolutely vital. But of course, one shouldn't be thinking of exporting everything, in the sense that some countries are stronger in some areas and others are stronger in others.
Right.
So one needs to be thinking about specializing pretty quickly, but you will only really know what your strengths are after a while, when you see also what type of maybe what investment there is, what support there is from foreign companies. So there's no much point in spending tons and tons of money trying to develop a sector where a particular country just will not be able to compete with others. So one has to have intelligent government intervention, intelligent spending on innovation, and choose your areas carefully.
Right, and those are very essential points that you've made here. Thank you so much, Ms. Vicky Price, for joining us and taking out the time to talk to us. Now we're joined by Dr. Kamel Wazne, who's an economist joining us from Lebanon. Thank you so much, Dr. Kamel, for joining us. Now, our earlier guests talked about how it's essential to be open to the world, and integration is necessary in the global economic system, global trade system. But what are the downfalls of this? Aren't developing economies becoming more vulnerable to the monopolies of the more developed economies when they do this?
You need integration, but you need a measured integration, because in the end, these small countries cannot really compete on the large scale, especially if they don't have the infrastructure and the development and the education system that enable them to compete globally. Today, the international economy has been dominated by large countries, and those large countries, it's very hard to compete with them head to head. On the other hand, you cannot really exclude yourself from integration. Even powers like the United States, in certain instances, is not able to compete with mass production from China. We have noticed that the world international trade has shifted to a couple countries around the globe. Mainly, if you look at the top traders in the world, you see China at the top, and then you see other countries like Germany, and then you see other countries like the U.S. But they don't. Even the U.S. does not come at the top. But we have to develop probably what really enable us, especially the limited resources, how to empower the innovation and the technology that is important to create wealth. In the end, if a country concentrates on one or on a couple areas where the innovation or the future of the business environment, that will give the edge to integrate very well. But small country have to be on guard when it comes to international trade, especially when they have a deficit on their current account and their balance of payment, and where they have to finance these heavily traded items, which is sometimes it adds to the deficit overall of the country. We have an experience in Lebanon where we have this problem where we actually import more than we are able to export, where our deficit is close to maybe like 16, 17 billion dollars in that end.
Right. Dr. Kamel, on that point, I want to ask another guest who's joined us, Mr. Einar Tangen, who's an analyst joining us from Melbourne. Thank you so much, Mr. Tangen, for joining us. Now, while we're talking about integration and trade, the global economic system, there is a political climate to take into account, one that is impacting the way trade was operating previously. Free trade is not the same as it was before. In all of this, do economies realize they need to rework how they've been operating?
Well, it's more than just the rules are changing. You have to look at why they have been changing. And, you see automation is really taken a toll. There's this feeling, especially among the middle class, who over the last 30 years, despite record profits for the companies, have actually seen a net loss. 90% of the people in the U.S. experienced a 0.4% decrease in real income over the last 30 years. So there's a lot of bad feelings about that, but it's an inevitable trend. You have companies that are competing. They have to do so, on price, basically, and quality and new ideas. And at a certain point, the price, it becomes a commodity, and price becomes very important. So you have that situation now. And it's going to get worse in essence because there's going to be more technology. We've already seen many forecasts that 50% of the jobs that we have today will, in essence, disappear. So on one hand, you have a changing world. You have the rules are changing in regard to that because the middle class are fed up. They feel they've been cheated somehow. They're actually have decided that the existing rules, the WTO, the World Bank, IMF, all of these things has somehow to blame for what has happened rather than understanding that it is in fact technology and things like that. So, but it's not all terrible news. What you have is a great opportunity. Countries have to start looking at what they spend and how they, manufacture in a slightly different way. There's basically two economies. There's a necessity economy, everything you need to live, personally. And then you have that's individual necessity. Then you have society necessity. How do you have people, living in groups and working productively in cities and things like that? Things like that are telecommunications, roads, sewers, water, all of these basic things that allow people to, in essence, live in urban settings. But the last one is the most important, and the only one that's really growing, and that is the choice economy. These are the things instead of buying one shirt that's you could easily get by with, or even get free, you will in essence decide you want to spend $1,000 for something you could have paid $1 for. And that is having a real effect. So countries have to start looking at, what are the necessities? Are they able to meet the necessities? And then after they've met those necessities, how they want to interact with this kind of choice economy.
Right.
And in terms of impact, it's about resources, how much you're bringing in, how efficient you are at adding value to them, and exporting them.
Right. Mr. Tangen, you mentioned an initial point, and I want Mr. Gilbert's take on this as well. The fact that technology and automation is a factor that must be accounted into. I mean, there is a lot of resentment towards what is happening, the inequality that's existing, but we're going to be seeing different trends in the near future. Now, how important is the role of ideas and knowledge in all of the trade system now, more than a few decades ago? And how is protectionism to patent those ideas and ensure that those aren't stolen? How is that increasing?
Well, we see it also in China happening. If you look back like 30 years or something like that, China was producing the cheap T-shirts, the sneakers, the toys. Today, we see a complete shift. This shift is also because the wage levels have changed within China. People get more paid for their job. So the technology level has been increased. You must go to a higher quality, higher added value. This has been promoted by the government, who has steered the economy towards more quality, more higher technology. Look at the car industry. 40 years ago, when I came to China, Belgium was producing more cars than China. Today, obviously, we don't talk about it anymore. But China has been pushing the big ones, the Mercedes, the Volkswagens, and everybody to bring the best technology.
Right. Mr. Gilbert, sorry to interrupt here, but what I do want to get towards is the role that data will play, the role that ideas and knowledge in this regard will play in the future when we are talking about trade.
This is already happening here. Many big factories in China, for example, the ones producing the iPhone and things like that, they are shifting now to robotics. They are shifting to automation full blast. But also data is becoming extremely important. China, obviously, they follow their own course, while the internet is sometimes regarded as an intranet because it's not completely linked to the outside world. But inside China, data processing, artificial intelligence, all go together hand in hand. There is no way to stop in this issue. So the government is encouraging a lot of creativity, innovation, artificial intelligence. These are the buzzwords today in China. And when you see the new technologies being developed, it is happening.
Right. Dr. Kamel, going to you and talking a little about what we were mentioning in terms of integration and how important that is. Now, an argument is to be made with how sanctions are being used as a political tool, as a diplomatic tool to pressurize governments. With all of this, it creates a precarious situation. Our economy is also moving towards the realization that self-reliance is definitely something that is worth investing in.
Well, obviously, when you talk about sanction and the way it's been used indiscriminately against many countries around the globe, that's a setback for economic integration, and this is a setback for the currency that we have used for a very long time as the dollar as the reserve of the reserve currency. In light of that, I think this has actually been hindering a lot of countries in terms of opening up and integrating with other countries. It impedes growth and it impedes the process of finding opportunity around the globe. So today, to be labeled or put on a list where you cannot wire your money, it's very dangerous for the stability of the financial system. My estimate, probably a lot of countries in East Asia, in Africa, been hammered by this issue. It has affected their business environment. They have affected their growth, and eventually a new world order is going to come and it's going to shape this continent, and it's going to be facing the status quo that exists today as the dominant power of the United States. I think countries have to find a way to work around sanctions if they're unfair and just, and most of them unfair and just. But in the end, I think country will find a way to prosper, but it will be a very long road before they are able to do that.
Right. Mr. Tangen, on that point of unfair and unjust trade practices, and while we're talking about development and growth for developing economies, what needs to be done in the international system to protect them or at least help them move forward while also establishing some balance of power?
I mean, what this reference is this kind of law of the jungle, which is being pushed by Donald Trump. He really believes that China, the most powerful economic, political, military country on earth, has somehow been cheated over the last 30 years, despite taking home the majority of profits from all of these activities. The growth was not there, but the profits certainly were. While the rest of the world basically had 1/3 of the profits, and you saw a marked increase in the number of middle-class people. China has prospered under the WTO. They are very interested in pushing multilateral groups, whether it's the AIIB or RCEP,
right.
Anything that the Belt and Road Initiative, anything that brings countries together. The U.S.
Right.
Seems to be pulling away from that.
Right. On that point, we're running time, but thank you so much, Mr. Einar Tangen, for joining us from Melbourne. Thank you, Dr. Kamel Wazne, and thank you, Mr. Gilbert Van Kerckhove, for joining us from Beijing. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye.